Hi scholars, we get started with Read Aloud again today. We're going to continue reading a biography. We know a biography is a true description about a real person's life. We've been reading about different important people from our country's past. Today we get to do that again. We're going to learn factual information about the person's childhood, goals, and accomplishments. Today we get to read a picture book of Harriet Tubman. Now, the purpose of reading this book is to learn more about her and her life. So we're going to learn about Harriet Tubman even more. Even if you've already heard her name before, I hope that you learn more information today. So as we get going, there's some important information that we need to know about the time period in which Harriet Tubman lived. Harriet Tubman lived in the 1840s, 50s, and 60s. During this time, slavery in the United States was legal in a lot of states in the South. So that meant that enslaved black people belonged to a white slave owner. And slaves were not treated very well. They lived in terrible conditions often and were punished and not treated nicely. So it's important that we know that because a lot of slaves from the South would try to escape up to the North because slavery was illegal in the North, so they could go there to be freed. But sometimes if they got caught trying to escape, it wouldn't end very well for them. So now that we know that information, we're going to go ahead and get started with our book about Harriet Tubman. Harriet Tubman was born in 1820 or 1821 on a large plantation in Dorchester County, Maryland. Although the plantation had a big house with many rooms and fine furniture, Harriet was born in a small, one-room log hut far behind the big house. The hut she was born in had a dirt floor, no windows, and no furniture. Harriet was the sixth of 11 children. Her father, Benjamin Ross, and her mother, Harriet Green, were both slaves. They were owned by Edward Broaddus. He owned Harriet Tubman too. So it was important that we had that information before we started the text to better understand Harriet's situation. The slaves worked hard all day, but they weren't paid. Harriet hated slavery. She was wild and often beaten. She was not willing to do as she was told. One time, when Harriet was hired out to work for someone else, she saw a bowl filled with lumps of sugar. And she said later, "Now, you know I never had anything good, no sweet, no sugar. And that sugar right by me did look so nice." She took one lump from the bowl. Let's stop and think about why Harriet Tubman decided to take a lump of sugar even though she wasn't supposed to. Now, I'm asking why a character did something. We know that's a character motivation question. We have a way to respond to character motivation questions to make sure we include the character's name, text evidence, and the character's wants. I'm going to show you how I would do that to answer this question. Why did Harriet Tubman take the lump of sugar even though it wasn't allowed? So the text says, Harriet said, "I never had anything good, no sweet, no sugar. And that sugar right by me did look so nice." And that makes me think that Harriet took the sugar because Harriet wanted to taste something delicious and have something good and sweet in her life because all of the other areas of her life and where she was living was not nice and sweet. But Harriet's mistress, Miss Susan, saw her take it and chased after her. Harriet ran from the house and hid, but when she came back, she got in trouble from Miss Susan. Edward Broaddus sold lumber, apples, wheat, and corn that grew on his plantation. Sometimes he took slaves he owned and sold them too, down the river to plantations further south. Harriet saw two of her sisters taken away in chains. Harriet was afraid that one day she too would be sold. When Harriet was a young girl, abolitionists, people against slavery, were beginning to speak out and protest. Abolitionist newspapers were being published. Let's stop and talk about that. Why were abolitionist papers being published? Well, in the text it says that the people against slavery were beginning to speak out and protest. So that lets me know that the papers were released and published because people wanted to spread the word about slavery and put an end to slavery. They were trying to persuade other people to help them stop slavery as well. Nat Turner, a young slave, knew how Moses had led the Israelites from slavery in Egypt. He hoped to lead his people out of slavery too. And in 1831, he started a rebellion. Slave owners, their wives, and their children were hurt. Nat Turner and others were caught and killed. Harriet dreamed that one day a true Moses would lead her to freedom. Wow, why would Nat Turner start a rebellion even though it was dangerous? Well, the text said that he hoped to lead his people out of slavery too. So that makes me think that Nat Turner started a rebellion because he wanted to free the enslaved people that he was with and around. In 1835, Harriet came between a master and a slave who was running away. The master threw a metal weight at the runaway, and it hit Harriet instead. Harriet had a deep cut in her forehead that never fully healed. For the next almost 80 years, Harriet suffered from severe headaches and sleeping spells. But she survived and thanked God for saving her. After the accident, she often prayed. In 1844, Harriet met John Tubman, a free man. They lived in his cabin near the plantation where Harriet was born. Harriet was thinking about running away. She wanted John to join her, but he wouldn't. He said that if she ran off, he would tell her master and that she would get caught and in trouble. But Harriet had made up her mind. She started planning her escape. Slaves often sang in the fields. The afternoon before Harriet ran off, she sang too. And in the words of her song was a message to other slaves. When the chariot comes, I'm going to leave you. I'm bound for the promised land. For Harriet Tubman, the promised land was north, where she would be free. We learned that earlier when we talked about the time period in which Harriet lived. We know that if she was able to make her way to the north, then she would be considered free and no longer be a slave. That's why she's considering that to be her promised land. Harriet escaped at night with 3 of her brothers. They had no food, no money, and they didn't know where to go. Soon after they left, Harriet's brothers decided to turn back. They made Harriet go back too. And 2 nights later, Harriet went off alone. I had a right to liberty or death. And she said, after her escape, if I could not have one, I would have the other. That word liberty means freedom. So she's saying, I had a right to freedom or death. And if she couldn't have one, then she would have the other. Let's stop and think there. I want us to think about why Harriet decided to go off alone. Remember, her brothers turned back, but Harriet decided to go on her own to the north. Why did Harriet go off alone without her brothers? When you're giving your response, make sure you're meeting the criteria for success. You can use this to help you. Use the character's name, the character's wants, and text evidence. I'm looking for you to type your response in a text, or you can write out your written response. When you're responding, you can go back and listen to the story to gather your text evidence. You guys have got it.